Welcome back to the Walk God's Way video series on Psalm 108. Tom Emmons here, and this is video number 2 out of 3 in the series. Our purpose here at Walk God's Way is to provide interactive, integrative, in-depth Bible study resources. And as a reminder, I encourage you to navigate over to our website at walkgodsway.com, where you can download a study guide that accompanies this video. Or you can just click on the link to the study guide in the video description below. It's totally free and it's beneficial in facilitating your observations from the text, your thoughts about the text, and your application of the text. So, to get the most out of this video study, pause the video for a moment, go get that study guide, then come back and restart the video. Now, in the first video on Psalm 108, we introduced the psalm and commented on the composite nature of the psalm. Psalm 108 is indeed a composite of Psalms 57 and 60. We also noted that Psalm 108 can be divided generally into 3 main divisions. Division 1, verses 1 through 9, deals with David's confidence in God. Division 2, verses 10 through 12, deals with David's crisis. And Division 3, verse 13, returns to confidence in God. It's like coming full circle at the end of the psalm. The psalm, however, as we said in the last video, has a more detailed contour than that. According to the themes of the psalm, I believe we could divide the psalm into the 4 sections that you see to the right of this slide. In the first video, we covered the first section, determination for God's praise. In this second video, we're moving on to sections 2 and 3, desire for God's preeminence and deliverance by God promised. So, let's begin by reading verses 5 and 6. Rise up above the sky, O God. May your splendor cover the whole earth. Deliver by your power and answer me, so that the ones you love may be safe. Now, I want you to look over those 2 verses carefully and go to your study guide and complete discovery number 3 at the top of page 5. In discovery 3, you're writing down the 4 things that David desired to see God do in these 2 verses. So pause the video here and come back when you finish with discovery number 3. So what does David desire to see God do? David implores God with the imperative, rise up, or be exalted in some translations, above the sky, O God. Now the next line doesn't have a verb in the Hebrew, but it also appears to be a wish, and so is understood to mean, may your splendor cover the whole earth. So David prays that God would rise up above the sky and that his splendor would cover the earth, right? Those are the first 2 things David desires to see God do. But aren't both of these things already true of God? Isn't God already above the sky, as it were? And doesn't his splendor cover the whole earth? Why would David pray these things to be when they already are? You see, I think we should stop and think about these things rather than just reading quickly through the text. And I think that verse 6 helps to clarify what's going on here in David's prayer. In verse 6, David prays that God would deliver his people by his power. Some translations say by your right hand, because the Hebrew text says right hand. But of course, God is spirit and therefore has no physical body. Therefore, we know that speaking of God's right hand is a figure of speech used to portray something about the nature of God, namely, in this case, his power or his might. He also prays that God would answer him. Now, these are the other two things David desired to see God do: deliver his people and answer his prayer. So, what is David praying for? He's praying for God's intervention, right? So, David's wishes in verse 5 that God rise up and that God's splendor cover the earth are to be viewed in the context of his desire for God's intervention. Here's the way to look at it then. David prays that God would act on his behalf, intervene, deliver, so that by that intervention, God would appear to all to be what he already is in reality: exalted, with his splendor covering the earth. So David is praying that that which is already true of God be made known through God's deliverance of his people, the ones he loves. What we have here then is the basis for David's prayer for God's deliverance. The basis for David's prayer for deliverance is his desire to see God exalted and God's splendor displayed throughout the entire earth. What this means is that in praying for deliverance and God's intervention, David's primary concern is not for himself and not even for Israel. His primary desire is for God's preeminence to be displayed, for God's greatness to be demonstrated. Now, take a moment to answer this question in your study guide, halfway down page 5. The question is this: how would you say your prayers typically differ from David's in reference to your primary concern when praying for God's help? So pause the video and come back to it after writing down your thoughts. Now, let's be honest. How do you and I typically pray when seeking God's action on our behalf? We pray, for instance, to be healed of sickness. We pray for deliverance from financial problems. We pray for deliverance from dangers as we travel. We pray for deliverance from so many things, and these prayers are good and they're necessary. But the question is this: what are our motives for praying for these things? Typically, our motive is simply that, to be delivered from the situation, right? Our primary concern in these types of prayers is for our well-being, or perhaps for the well-being of someone else. When we pray for a sick friend or a loved one to get better, for instance, what is our primary concern? Is it not typically and simply that they get better? That's what we want. But if it is, then we're not praying like David. We don't have a heart like the man after God's own heart had. David's prayer for deliverance was based on a greater, more fundamental desire to see God's preeminence displayed to everyone, everywhere. So how shallow, how self-serving are our prayers compared to David's? Now, in the midst of this national calamity, this rejection by God and David's passionate prayer for deliverance, God speaks a word of hope to David, a word of promised deliverance. And this brings us to our third section of the psalm, deliverance by God promised, in verses 7 through 9. Verses 7 through 9, God has spoken in his sanctuary, saying, I will triumph, I will parcel out Shechem, the valley of Sukkoth I will measure off. Gilead belongs to me, as does Manasseh. Ephraim is my helmet, Judah my royal scepter. Moab is my wash basin. I will make Edom serve me. I will shout in triumph over Philistia. Now look over the text. We can see that God brings this word of hope in both representative and symbolic fashion. Let's look at the representative aspect first. As we go through this, you can fill in the blanks that you'll find in your study guide on this section. Shechem represents the region west of the Jordan River, while the Sukkoth Valley represents the area east of the Jordan. Then God specifies 2 locations east of the Jordan and 2 west of the Jordan, in that order. So Gilead is located east of the Jordan, and the half-tribe of Manasseh also settled east of the Jordan. Ephraim and Judah were the 2 main tribes that settled west of the Jordan. So God uses these references as representative of all the areas that comprise the promised land of Israel, both in Palestine and the Transjordan region. What is God doing? He is implicating his sovereignty over his people and over the promised land of Canaan. But of course, God is not sovereign over his people only, his special people. God is sovereign over all nations. Moab, Edom, and Philistia are representative of the nations and of Israel's enemies. Moab and Edom are mentioned next in the text, and they're located on the east. These are followed by Philistia, which is on the far west. The implication is that from east to west, God is sovereign over all nations and all peoples, including Israel's enemies. A very important point for God to make in light of the recent defeat by Israel's enemies. Now, just as an interesting fact about the psalm, notice how David arranged these representatives. He uses what we can call a double chiastic structure. Now, here's what I mean. He starts with Shechem in the west. We'll assign the letter A to references to the west. Then he goes to Sukkoth in the east. We'll assign the letter B to references to the east. So far, we have west, then east, A, then B, right? Now, next in the text, we see Gilead and Manasseh located where? In the east. Then Ephraim and Judah in the west. So we can assign B2 to Gilead and Manasseh, since they are the second reference to the east. We can assign A2 to Ephraim and Judah because they are the second reference to the west. So now we have west, east, east, west, or A, B, B2, A2. That's the first chiastic structure. Now, why do we call it a chiastic structure? We call it a chiastic structure or a chiasm because when we diagram it, it looks like the Greek letter chi, which looks a lot like an English X. If you were to draw a line through each, like we do on the screen here, each of the A and B couplets, and extend each line all the way out, you would have the letter chi. As you can see, the chiasm resembles the front half of the chi. So next, David uses the final leg of that first chiasm, the A2, to begin the second chiasm. So again, Ephraim and Judah are a reference to the west. They were A2. Then Moab and Edom are a reference to the east. And being the third reference to the east, within the overall double chiasm, we'll assign the letter B3 to this reference. And finally, we have Philistia, our third reference to the west, and so we will assign it the letter A3. The second chiasm then is west, east, west, or A2, B3, A3. So now we have the complete double chiasm, west, east, east, west, east, west. Or, using the numbers, the letters, A, B, B2, A2, B3, A3. Now, this double chiastic structure shows the literary skill employed in writing the psalm, and it also served as an aid to the memory. But at any rate, the psalm declares God's sovereignty through these representatives. The psalm also declares God's sovereignty through symbolism. God refers to Ephraim as his what? His helmet. A literal translation of the Hebrew would be the protection of my head. Some translations, for instance, the King James Version, translate it as the strength of my head rather than protection. But the Hebrew word more specifically conveys the idea of protection or safety. Ephraim, having settled just west of the Jordan River, is in this way depicted as playing a primary role in the defense of the land against enemies from the east. Yet notice that Ephraim is not Israel's helmet, but God's helmet. God is the one speaking, and he says Ephraim is the protection of my head. Now, we're not to understand God's use of the first person, my, possessive pronoun, to indicate that he is in need of protection, or even that Ephraim is protecting God in some way. Rather, we are to understand that Ephraim, the helmet of protection, belongs to God, and God will utilize Ephraim for the defense of his people and their land. So once again, God makes us privy to his sovereignty. Next, Judah is God's what? Royal scepter. The royal scepter is symbolic of what? It's symbolic of rulership, and it was from the tribe of Judah that God raised up the Davidic kingship. Again, it is God's royal scepter. Judah belongs to God, and God will establish his own rule over his people through the rule of the Davidic line of kings. God's sovereignty is once more on display here. Now, Moab has the distinct pleasure of being God's wash basin. What would you rather be, a royal scepter or a wash basin? Exactly. A wash basin is used to wash hands and feet. To say that Moab will be God's wash basin is to claim that Moab will play a servant's role. They will serve God's people. The same is said of Edom, only with a rather peculiar idiom. The Hebrew text reads something like, "Over Edom I will throw my sandal." Although this particular metaphor is not easily understood, it is apparently referring to a master throwing his dirty sandal to a servant so that the servant would dust it off for him. In this case, God is predicting that Edom will play the role of servant to his people, just as would Moab. And then we see Philistia. They will face no better fate. God will shout in triumph over Philistia. A shout of triumph is symbolic of defeating one's enemy. God will demonstrate his utter sovereignty in the way that he deals with these nations that wage war against his people. So God's sovereignty has been depicted in representative form and through symbolism. But we're not through discovering God's sovereignty in this psalm yet. His sovereignty is also seen in each of the I will statements. I will triumph. I will parcel. I will measure off. I will make. I will shout. And also in the repetitive use of that first person possessive pronoun, or its equivalent, belongs to me, my helmet, my royal scepter, my wash basin. In other words, these three verses are completely saturated with God's sovereignty. In multiple ways, God reminds David that although he has rejected Israel for the moment, he is still sovereign, still in control over the entire earth, that all nations, all peoples belong to him, and that no nation, no one, and nothing can hope to stand against him. Now, if you and I are honest, we might have to admit that there are times in life when our confidence in God's sovereignty, that he's really in control, is critically challenged. We have battles within and without. Our enemy, Satan, wages war against us in our minds, toying with our emotions. In a world full of various troubles and trials and temptations, we often succumb to fears, to falsehoods, and to feelings of despair. Sometimes we're just stuck in hopeless situations from which there seems no way out. And oftentimes out of desperation or discouragement or even intentional defiance, convinced that God won't change our situation, we act outside of God's revealed will in order to change it ourselves. And that's never a good idea. Maybe you can think of a specific time when you faced difficulties, perhaps even when God's rejection, and you struggled with those fears, believed Satan's falsehoods, and gave in to feelings of utter despair. In your study guide, you might want to just jot a few notes down about that time in your life. And if you're in a small group, perhaps you can share some of those ideas and thoughts with your small group. And then come back to the video when you're finished. Well, David knew exactly what it was like to feel rejected by God, to have to deal with those thoughts that maybe God might never act on his behalf to deliver him from a hopeless situation. If you're feeling this way, know that you are not the first to feel this way, and you won't be the last. Sometimes we like to soak in our self-pity by believing that our situation is so unique that no one else has experienced the same thing. Well, that's a lie. One that Satan uses to keep us wallowing in our self-pity and even angry at God at times and questioning him. We have to be careful that we don't fall for that lie or fall into that trap. It's an extremely difficult one to climb out of. God has gone out of his way to declare and demonstrate his sovereignty. There is no reason for not having confidence in it. Whatever hopelessness we face does not alter the nature or character of God. He is by nature sovereign, and that never changes. Is it not an insult to God for us to think that he is not in control of our particular situation? Sometimes the things we go through, the times when we believed God has rejected us, have as their purpose to train us to trust his sovereignty more, to have greater confidence in it, so as to bring him greater glory. You see, God has an agenda for us, for each of us, and he will take any crisis in our lives as an opportunity to further that agenda. That, I believe, is the point James is making in James 1, 2 through 4, where he writes, "My brothers and sisters, consider it nothing but joy when you fall into all sorts of trials, difficulties, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you will be perfect and complete, not deficient in anything." God never wastes a crisis, and that's very good news. How wasteful, senseless, and meaningless would any crisis in our lives be if it didn't serve a divine purpose, if it weren't furthering God's agenda for us? But of course, we have the responsibility to allow God to teach us through it. In Psalm 108, God declares his sovereignty so that we might trust his sovereignty and have more confidence in it. It's somewhat of a paradox that it's in a crisis of confidence that our confidence in his sovereignty can bloom and grow even fuller. The closer we're brought to hopelessness, the more our hope can grow in God's deliverance, and thus the greater our confidence will be in his sovereignty. This paradox is actually brought out more in the final section of the psalm, verses 10 through 13, which we cover in the third and final video of the series. So remember, you can find study guides to each of our videos at walkgodsway.com. You can also find other great content there and resources like PowerPoint presentations and interactive Bible study lessons, lesson plans that can all be downloaded there from the website. We're always adding content, so check the website and the YouTube channel often. And if you've benefited by this video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And until next time, may God bless your time in